Before we begin, if you find yourself lulled by the grim charm of tales where optimism is a death sentence and fairy tales are more funeral dirge than lullaby, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, the stories are designed not to sing you to sleep, but to keep you just awake enough to wonder why you ever trusted a talking wolf in the first place. Now, let us turn to Chapter 1, Fée Naïve Optimist. Once, in a village so quaint it could only exist in a story designed to kill you, there lived a soul so relentlessly cheerful that even the local executioner found it excessive. His name was Hubert, though no one remembered it long enough to carve it on his grave. Hubert believed in the goodness of all things, especially the things that grinned with too many teeth or offered help without being asked. The villagers, who had survived long enough to know better, avoided the woods where the wolves spoke in riddles and the witches baked kindness into their pies. But Hubert whistled as he strolled beneath the gnarled branches, convinced that danger was just a myth invented by the tragically unadventurous. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a warning Hubert mistook for beauty, he encountered a wolf. Not just any wolf. This one wore a smile like a well-fitted coat and spoke with the smooth cadence of a politician. "Good evening, traveler," the wolf said, its voice honeyed with false concern. "The path ahead is treacherous, but I know a shortcut, a safer route if you will." Hubert, whose optimism had long since drowned out his survival instincts, clasped his hands in gratitude. "How kind of you!" he exclaimed, as if predators were in the habit of altruism. The wolf led him deep into the woods, where the trees grew so close they whispered secrets Hubert was too naive to hear. "Tell me," the wolf purred, "do you trust easily?" Hubert laughed, the sound echoing like a dinner bell. "Of course. I find suspicion so dreadfully unpleasanting." The wolf's grin widened. It was the last expression Hubert ever saw clearly. Meanwhile, in a cottage that smelled suspiciously of sugar and grave dirt, a witch hummed as she stirred a pot. Her help was always free, her prices always fair, provided one didn't read the fine print etched in blood at the bottom of her contracts. When Hubert knocked, seeking shelter from the storm, conveniently arranged by the witch herself, she welcomed him with open arms and a ladle full of something bubbling. "Eat, dear," she urged, her voice the texture of cobwebs. "It'll warm your bones." Hubert, who had never met a stranger he didn't trust or a drink he wouldn't swallow, obliged. By dawn his bones were indeed warm, stacked neatly in the witch's fireplace. The villagers found his remains, or what was left of them, scattered in places that defied explanation. They sighed, buried the pieces, and went back to their lives. After all, this was why they avoided the woods. But Hubert, he became a cautionary tale, a footnote in the ledger of the dead who should have known better. His optimism hadn't been a virtue. It was a liability, a blindfold in a world where even the trees had agendas. Fairy tales, you see, are not about happy endings. They're about survival. And the first to die are always the ones who mistake a smile for sincerity, a helping hand for anything but a prelude to the grave. So, the next time a wolf offers you a shortcut, or a witch serves you a meal too generous to refuse, remember Hubert, and run. Chapter 2. The Disobedient Wanderer. The village had rules, as all sensible places do, and the first among them was this: stay on the path. It was painted on signs, sewn into nursery rhymes, and whispered by mothers with the same solemnity as prayers. The path was safe. The path was known. The path, at the very least, did not actively wanting to eat you. Enter Elara. Elara was the sort of person who saw a sign reading EJDO, not enter, and took it as a personal invitation. She was not malicious, nor particularly reckless, just curious, which was often worse. The villagers called her Gay Girl with questions in her pocketskin, because she collected them like coins, turning each one over in her hands until they burned. Why must the path be followed? Who decided? What exactly was so terrible about the mossy glade just beyond the third oak? Old Man Darrow, who had lost half his fingers to frostbite and the other half to a bargain with something he refused to name, spat into the fire when she asked. "The path is the path," he said. "Stray, and you stray into stories. And stories EJ'd you." Elara smiled, thanked him, and the next morning set out toward the third oak. The moment her foot left the packed earth of the path, the air changed. It was not just the silence, though that was immediate, as if the wind itself had gasped, but the achy texture of things. The leaves were too green, the shadows too deep, and the scent of wildflowers carried a sweetness that bordered on obscene. She took another step, then another. Behind her, unseen, the path sighed and let her go. She found the glade just as she'd imagined. Dappled sunlight, a brook chuckling to itself, mushrooms in perfect rings. It was beautiful. It was wrong. The first clue was the bones. Not scattered, not gnawed, arranged. A rabbit's skull here, a deer's ribs there, all polished white and placed with the care of a museum curator. The second clue was the brook itself, which upon closer inspection was laughing. Not metaphorically. Actual giggles bubbled up between the rocks. Elara crouched, dipping her fingers into the water. "Why are you laughing?" The brook splashed her wrist. "You are off the path," it whispered, delighted. She stood, suddenly uneasy, but curiosity had its claws in her now. At the center of the glade stood a door. Just a door, no house, no frame, just weathered oak and an iron handle, wedged between two trees as if it had grown there. Every story she'd ever heard screamed at her to turn back. Every instinct said, "This is how you vanish." Kaibut Elara had never been good at listening. The door opened before she touched it. Beyond was a feast. A table groaned under pies, roasted meats, fruits glistening like jewels. The smell was intoxicating. A figure sat at the head of the table, hooded, motionless. "Hungry, traveler?" it asked, voice like roots breaking stone. Elara's stomach growled. She knew the stories. Knew, logically, that eating fairy food doomed you. But the berries looked so ripe, and the bread so warm, and surely just Jonah bite. She woke up in the dark. Not the dark of night, the dark of windside. Imazbaz pressed close, damp and earthy. Her fingers scraped wood. A coffin. Known to a larder. Above her, something shuffled. A voice, the same one from the table, murmured, "Winter's coming. Best stock up." Elara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. Outside, the brook laughed and laughed. Back in the village, Old Man Darrow saw the empty place at the tavern table and nodded to himself. The path was the path for a reason. Wanderers were always the first to go, not because the world beyond was cruel, but because it was hungry. Any curiosity, no matter how bright, made for a very small meal. Chapter 3. The Braggart Hero. The village of Black Hollow had seen its share of heroes, or rather, it had seen the remains of them. There was a particular oak near the crossroads, where the crows grew fat, and the locals had learned to treat the arrival of any sword-waving, destiny-proclaiming stranger with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a plague of locusts. Enter Sir Gareth of the Unbreakable Will. He arrived on a horse too tall for the muddy streets, clad in armor that gleamed as if polished by angels, or more likely, a long-suffering squire. His cloak billowed dramatically, even when there was no wind, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had never once questioned his own importance. "Good people love—" He glanced down at a scrap of parchment. "Black Holloway, rejoice, for I have come to rid you of the beast that lurks in the dark mire." The villagers exchanged glances. The beast in question was an elderly wyvern with arthritis and a fondness for stealing sheep. Not for eating them, but for the company. It mostly napped in the sun and occasionally coughed up smoke rings. Old Thomas, who had once lost a boot to the wyvern's playful gnawing, cleared his throat. "That's nice of you, Mord, but truth be told, we've sort of gotten used to old Snaggles. He don't mean no harm." Gareth waved this away like a bad smell. "Nonsense. A beast is a beast, and I, Sir Gareth, slayer of the Hydra of Orth, defeater of the ice giants of Karak, and the only man to ever survive the kiss of the Black Widow Queen, shall not rest until this land is purged of its terror." A child in the crowd whispered, "That's a lot of titles." Her mother sighed. "That's a lot of trouble." And so, with much fanfare and absolutely no self-awareness, Gareth set off toward the Darkmire, pausing only to announce, to no one in particular, that he feared no creature, mortal or otherwise, for fate itself had deemed him invincible. The trees, being old and fond of irony, rustled their leaves in what might have been laughter. The wyvern was, as usual, napping in a sunbeam, when Gareth came crashing through the undergrowth, sword raised, voice booming. "Foul creature, your reign of terror ends today." Snaggles blinked one golden eye open, heaved a sigh that smelled vaguely of mutton, and rolled onto his other side. "Underterret Gareth struck a heroic pose. Do you not know who I am? I have faced worse than you, and laughed in the face of death." The wyvern, who had not asked for any of this, exhaled a thin stream of smoke in what might have been annoyance. Gareth took this as a challenge. "You think your petty flames can harm me? I have walked through dragon fire unscathed. My skin is like iron. My will unshakable, It was at this point that Snaggles, in a move that suggested he'd been holding onto this trick for years, sneezed. Not a normal sneeze. A wyvern sneeze. A gout of flame, mucus and partially digested sheep wool engulfed Sir Gareth. When the smoke cleared, the armor was still standing, gleaming as ever. The villagers, who had followed at a safe distance, mostly to see if the wyvern needed help, watched as the visor creaked open. A single charred hand emerged, clutching a scrap of scorched parchment. The child from earlier squinted. "Is that a lost will and testament?" The mother nodded. "Braggart insurance." The hand spasmed once, then dropped. The armor toppled with a hollow clang. Snaggles, after a moment of consideration, nudged the helmet with his snout. When it didn't move, he shrugged, an impressive feat for a creature with no shoulders, and settled back into his nap. Back in the village, old Thomas took a long sip of ale and said what everyone was thinking. "Well, that's that then." The next morning, a new sign appeared near the crossroads, painted in careful letters. "Heroes, please do not disturb the wyvern." And the crows, as always, feasted well. Chapter 4. The Overly Literal Thinker. The village of Black Hollow had long since learned that words were knives, and fairy tales loved nothing more than to twist them until they cut. Curses thrived on misinterpretation. Riddles were designed to mislead. Even simple warnings, when taken too literally, could lead a person directly into the jaws of something unpleasant, or worse, into a bureaucratic agreement with a goblin. Enter Ulrich the accountant. Ulrich was a man of numbers, of precise measurements, of contracts with clauses so watertight they could strangle a sea serpent. He wore spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling degree, and he spoke in a voice that suggested he was perpetually on the verge of correcting someone's grammar. When the villagers spoke of the Witch of the White Well and her infamous bargains, they did so in hushed, metaphorical tones. Ulrich, however, heard only the facts. "The witch offers deals," said old Thomas, puffing on his pipe. "But mark my words, lad, her gifts come with strings tighter than a hangman's noose." Ulrich adjusted his spectacles. Strings can be cut. Thomas exhaled a slow, pitying cloud of smoke. Not these ones. But Ulrich had already made up his mind. The witch's well was said to grant anything a person desired, for a price. And prices to Ulrich were simply numbers waiting to be negotiated. The well sat in a clearing where the sunlight never quite reached the ground. The water was clear enough to see the bottom, though the bottom seemed to shift whenever one looked too closely. The witch herself was neither old nor young, but something in between, like a book whose pages had been thumbed too often. "I require wealth," Ulrich announced, dispensing with pleasantries. "Substantial wealth, preferably in coin, not livestock or other perishable assets." The witch smiled, a slow unfurling of teeth. "And what will you give me in return?" Ulrich had prepared for this. "A tenth of my earnings, paid annually, with interest calculated at a fair market rate, of course." The witch blinked. "Of course. Furthermore," Ulrich continued, "I'd like a clause stipulating that any supernatural interference in my financial growth, such as curses, hexes, or unexpected plagues, renders the agreement null and void." The witch stared at him. Then she laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. "Oh, I like you. Very well. A tenth of your earnings, no tricks." She held out a hand, and a scroll appeared, covered in elegant looping script. Ulrich read it 3 times. It was, as far as he could tell, flawless. He signed with a flourish. The next morning, his house was gone. Not destroyed. Not vanished. In its place stood a towering pile of gold coins, stacked so precisely they formed a perfect replica of his home, down to the tiny golden latch on the gate. Ulrich's spectacles fogged with disbelief. This is literal." A passing crow, familiar with the witch's sense of humor, cackled. The contract, of course, had been honored to the letter. Ulrich had wealth beyond imagining. He just couldn't spend any of it without dismantling his own dwelling. When he stormed back to the well, the witch was waiting. "You said no tricks," Ulrich hissed. The witch examined her nails. "I said wouldn't trick you. I never said the magic wouldn't." Meanwhile, in the village, the baker's daughter, a girl who had once traded a loaf of bread for a fox's advice, shook her head as she passed Ulrich's golden prison. "Should they've asked for a fortune?" she murmured. "Not a ye house made of coins." Ulrich, trapped inside his glittering folly, could only watch as the villagers went about their lives, blissfully unburdened by the dangers of taking things at face value. And the witch, as always, poured herself a cup of well water and toasted the next fool who would inevitably come calling. Chapter 5. The Unlucky Third Sibling. There was an unspoken rule in Black Hollow, as in all places touched by the old stories: never be the third sibling. The eldest was destined for responsibility, the middle for cleverness, and the third was destined for misfortune, narrow escapes, and the occasional tragic but narratively satisfying demise. The Claiborne family had 3 sons. This was their first mistake. Eldest was Garrett, broad-shouldered and solemn, groomed since birth to inherit the mill and the family's single good axe. Middle was Calm, who could talk his way out of a bear's stomach and into its will. And then there was Finn. Finn was the sort of child who fell into wells that weren't there the day before, who mistook wolfsbane for parsley and lived to tell the tale, though the tale was mostly incoherent babbling about singing badgers. When the witch of the White Well needed someone to test a potion, she left a free sample on Finn's windowsill. It was simply how the world worked. So when the Claiborne patriarch gathered his sons and announced that the family's prized sow had vanished into the howling wood, no one was surprised by how the roles were assigned. "Garrett," he said, "you'll track her. Calm, you'll negotiate if she's been taken. And Finn, try not to die." Finn, who had once survived eating an entire pie laced with sleepweed, the baker had labeled it clearly, nodded gamely. Garrett entered the wood at dawn, armed with his axe and a lifetime of stern advice. By noon he'd found the sow, or rather what was left of her. The creature that had taken her was not a wolf, nor a bear, but something with too many eyes and a laugh like a cracking spine. Garrett swung his axe. The axe shattered. He returned home pale and quiet, and no one asked him to explain. Colm went next, armed only with his wits and a pouch of silver. He found the beast lounging in a clearing, picking its teeth with a ribbon. "Ah," said Colm, seamlessly shifting into his winning deal voice. "I see you've already eaten. A shame. She was meant to be part of a mutually beneficial trade arrangement." The creature belched. "I'm listening." 2 hours later, Colm returned to the village with a signed contract guaranteeing the beast would only take livestock every other Tuesday, and never the black sheep. They were bad for its digestion. The villagers applauded his ingenuity. The beast, meanwhile, cackled into its claws. Contracts, after all, could be interpreted. Then there was Finn. Finn wandered into the wood with no weapon, no plan, and a half-eaten apple he'd found in his pocket. The trees leaned in to watch. The beast, bored by competent siblings, perked up. "Well," it said, stretching to its full, grotesque height. "A third course." Finn blinked. "Oh, you're the one that ate our pig." The beast grinned. "And?" Finn considered this. Then he held out the apple. "Dessert?" The beast paused. No one had ever offered it dessert. It sniffed the apple suspiciously. Finn, who had once accidentally brewed a potion that turned his neighbor's chickens transparent, smiled innocently. The beast took a bite. 5 seconds later, it was writhing on the ground, howling about colors that didn't exist. Finn sat on a rock and waited politely for it to stop screaming. When it finally lay whimpering, he leaned down and whispered, "The apples grow near the white well. Maybe don't eat those?" The beast, now terrified of small, polite humans, fled and was never seen again. Finn returned to the village with the sow's collar, the only part she hadn't digested, and an offhand remark about how the beast had left in a hurry. The villagers, long accustomed to the peculiar survival of third siblings, simply nodded and made a note to never let Finn near the cider press again. And high in her tower, the Witch of the White Well crossed another name off her list of potential future problems. Some third siblings, it seemed, were just too unlucky to die. Chapter 6. The Ignorer of Warnings. In Black Hollow, warnings were as common as rain and twice as likely to be ignored. The villagers knew better, of course. When an old woman muttered about storm clouds with teeth, you stayed indoors. When a raven croaked, "Turn back" in perfect high Gothic, you turned back. But outsiders never learned, and that was why the graveyard had a whole section marked "They should have listened." Enter Lady Isolde of the Silver Spurs. She arrived at dusk, riding a stallion so white it hurt to look at, her cloak lined with what she claimed were purely decorative protective runes. The villagers took one look at her, at the way she tossed her hair at cautionary tales, at the way her boots gleamed with the hubris of someone who had never stepped in unseen bog water, and collectively decided to let nature take its course. Old Thomas, leaning on his stick, cleared his throat as she passed the inn. "The bridge is out down yonder, milady. Best take the ford." Isolde didn't slow. "I've crossed worse." A fox trotted alongside her horse for half a mile, finally remarking, "The miller's daughter vanished near these trees last week. They say her screams still sound at moonrise." Isolde flicked a coin at it. "Buy yourself a muzzle." The fox caught the coin in its teeth and vanished, but not before giving her a look that promised retribution in small, annoying ways. By the time she reached the bridge, which was, in fact, very much intact, even the wind had given up on her. The planks creaked under her horse's weight, and a voice like rusted hinges groaned from the rafters. "Turn back, proud rider. No steel can pierce what waits ahead." Isolde drew her sword, which gleamed with the expensive sheen of something never actually used. I fear no shadows. The bridge sighed and let her pass. What waited in the clearing beyond was not a monster, nor a witch, nor any of the usual hazards. It was a chair. A perfectly ordinary wooden chair sitting alone in a patch of sunlight. On its seat lay a single apple, so red it seemed to pulse. Any sensible person would have burned the clearing and fled the county. Isolde dismounted. The apple was warm. The chair, when she tested it with one hand, was solid. The warning tingling at the base of her skull she ignored with practiced ease. She sat. She bit into the apple. The first thing she noticed was the taste, not apple at all, but something metallic and thick. The second was the way the chair's arms had become hands, gripping hers with the casual strength of ancient timber. The third was the apple's core, which was not seeds but teeth, human and perfectly white. From the trees the fox watched as the lady's struggles grew slower, then stopped altogether. The chair absorbed her inch by inch until only her silver spurs remained, gleaming on the grass like a particularly expensive tombstone. Back in the village, old Thomas nursed his ale and remarked, "That's the third one this month." The miller's daughter, who had in fact escaped her own encounter with the chair by the simple expedient of not sitting in cursed furniture, nodded. At least this one left good spoons. And the bridge, when the next traveler came, creaked out its warning again. This time, for once, someone listened. But that, as they say, is another story. Chapter 7. The Overly Trusting Lover. Black Hollow had seen its share of tragic romances, the kind that ended in disappearances or transformations, or the occasional public scolding from a vindictive fairy godmother. The villagers had learned the hard way that love, in their world, was less a matter of the heart and more a matter of survival instincts. Enter Rosalind of the Rosewood Glen. She was the sort of woman who sighed at sunsets, who believed in love at first sight, and who had, on more than one occasion, been caught whispering sweet nothings to particularly handsome fireflies. Her cottage was littered with unfinished sonnets and half-knitted scarves intended for suitors who never called again. Old Thomas, who had buried 3 wives, one of whom had merely been pretending to be dead as part of an elaborate tax evasion scheme, took one look at Rosalind's latest dreamy expression and groaned. "Oh, not again." Rosalind clasped her hands to her chest. "This time is different. He's a great prince." The villagers exchanged glances. The last prince to pass through had been a hedgehog in a stolen crown. He arrived at twilight, she sighed, riding a stallion black as midnight, his cloak lined with silver like the stars themselves. He said I had the voice of a nightingale and the grace of a summer breeze. Com, the middle Claiborne brother, snorted into his ale. Did he also say he needed a place to stash cursed treasure, because that's how Marta lost her barn? Rosalind waved this away. "He's taking me to his castle tonight. At last, my happily ever after." The fox, lounging by the hearth, yawned. "Is the castle by any chance made of bones?" She gasped. "How did you know?" The villagers groaned in unison. The prince, who had introduced himself as a Valtharian of the Obsidian Towershing, a name that should have been its own warning, was in fact entirely genuine. That was the problem. His castle was made of bones. Not metaphorically. Not, "Oh, the stone just looks a bit skeletal." Actual polished femurs and rib cages mortared together with something suspiciously like dried blood. The drawbridge lowered on chains of interlocking finger bones. Rosalind, too busy admiring how the moonlight caught the prince's cheekbones, a terrible choice of words in hindsight, didn't notice until it was too late. "My family has a tradition," Valtharian murmured as he led her inside, his grip just a shade too tight on her wrist. "Every century we take a bride, just one, to, renew the foundations." Rosalind, finally sensing danger, paused on the threshold. The air smelled of damp earth and old copper. "That's metaphorical, right?" The prince smiled. His teeth were very white and very pointed. Back in the village, the baker's daughter, who had once escaped a betrothal to a river spirit by the simple expedient of asking why all his previous wives were currently underwater, paused mid-need. "Wait, did Rosalind say obsidian towershing?" Old Thomas nodded grimly. The baker's daughter cursed. "That's not a castle. It's a digestive system." Meanwhile, Rosalind was realizing several things in quick succession. 1. The tapestries were stretched human skin. 2. The chandelier was a suspended skeleton holding its own glowing organ. 3. The prince's kiss tasted like grave dirt. She screamed. The prince sighed. They always do that. Rosalind's survival, for she did survive, albeit with a newfound aversion to romantic poetry, was due entirely to 3 factors. First, the Claiborne's third son, Finn, happened to be lost in the woods again, this time armed with a bucket of pig's blood. Long story. Second, the prince's castle was allergic to pig's blood. Third, Finn mistook the prince for a tree and tried to water him. By dawn, the castle had retracted into the earth like a disgruntled mollusk. The prince was howling curses from a nearby bog, and Rosalind was back in Black Hollow, swearing off men forever. The fox, licking pig's blood off its paws, remarked, "She'll be engaged again by Tuesday." And sure enough, come Tuesday, Rosalind was sighing over a mysterious bard who, he definitely wasn't a werewolf. Some people never learned. But then, that was why the graveyard kept expanding. Chapter 8. The Greedy Fool. There was a saying in Black Hollow: the first coin is free. The second costs your soul. The third takes your kneecaps. This was not metaphorical. Old Man Darrow could attest to the kneecap part, though he maintained it had been worth it for the view from the dragon's hoard. Enter Bartholomew the Bold, self-titled. Bartholomew arrived in town on a wagon pulled by 2 suspiciously identical donkeys. Suspicious because donkeys weren't normally capable of winking in perfect unison. The wagon bore a sign reading, "Ike Fortunes Found." Treasures Tamid. In letters that shimmered unpleasantly like grease on water. The villagers took one look at the man's gold-capped teeth, real gold, poorly fitted, and his cloak lined with what he claimed were lucky weasels. They were just weasels, and prepared the customary betting pool on how he would die. "I seek the Cave of Avarice," Bartholomew announced to the tavern at large, "where the rivers run with gold and the very walls pulse with gems." Old Thomas set down his ale. "That's a digestive metaphor." "Nonsense." Bartholomew's grin flashed like a shoddy mirror. "I've heard the tales. Any man who takes but one handful may leave a king." The baker's daughter, who had once outwitted a leprechaun by the simple expedient of not looking at the goldlay, sighed. "And what happens if you take 2 handfuls?" Bartholomew winked. "Then you leave an emperor." The fox, perched on a barrel, began chewing through the rope holding up Bartholomew's trousers. It was a preemptive strike. The Cave of Avarice did exist, though locals called it the Old Smog's Column for reasons best left unexplored. Its entrance yawned at the base of the mountain, exhaling air that smelled of sulfur and bad decisions. The walls did indeed glitter, not with gems, but with the glassy eyes of previous visitors who had become part of the decor. Bartholomew plunged in without hesitation. The first chamber was everything the tales promised: coins ankle-deep, jewels crusting the walls like barnacles, a literal throne of solid platinum with the handy property of Bartholomew the Boldgy plaque already affixed. He laughed, scooped one greedy handful. Nothing happened. The cave waited. Bartholomew hesitated. Then he took another handful, and another. When his pockets bulged, he began filling his boots. When his boots overflowed, he stuffed coins into his mouth. The gold caps had given him a taste for it. It was when he pried a ruby the size of his fist from the throne that the cave gay coughed. The coins underfoot became a slope. The slope became a chute. The chute deposited Bartholomew into a second, much larger chamber, where the throne was, in fact, the tip of a very large, very annoyed tail. The dragon, for it was a dragon, albeit one that looked like it had been woken mid-nap, furled itself with the creaky dignity of a landlord inspecting rent, arrears. Its scales were the color of tarnished pennies, its breath the scent of a tax auditor's office. "One a handfuling," it rumbled. "Is the ye rulin'?" Bartholomew, who had never met a rule he couldn't ignore for profit, brandished his lute. "Findus keepers." The dragon sighed. Then it ate him. Not dramatically, not with fire and screaming, but with a weary efficiency of someone disposing of spoiled milk. Back in Black Hollow, the villagers heard the distant kite thump of the cave. Ceiling shut and moved the betting pool money to the eaten by dragon column. The baker's daughter shook her head. "You'd think people would learn." Old Thomas raised his ale. "You would be wrong." And the two donkeys, now winking at three different villagers simultaneously, trotted off to seek their next mark. Some fools, after all, were renewable resources. Chapter 9. The Unprepared Adventurer. In Black Hollow, survival often hinged on carrying the right tools at the right time. A twist of rowan bark could mean the difference between a peaceful night and being lured into the swamp by will-o'-the-wisps. A handful of salt was cheaper than an exorcism. And anyone who entered the Weeping Woods without a blindfold was, statistically speaking, already dead. They just hadn't stopped moving yet. Enter Reginald the Reckless, a nickname he'd earned at age 6 by attempting to ride a sheep over a cliff. Reginald arrived at the village inn with a sword too large for his scabbard, and a pack suspiciously light for someone planning to conquer the northern ruins. The villagers eyed his equipment, or lack thereof, with the practiced dread of midwives inspecting an undercooked baby. "Planning to visit the Singing Stones, are you?" asked old Thomas, noting the complete absence of wool-lined gloves in Reginald's kit. Reginald scoffed. "I don't need nursery talismans. Steel and courage see a man through." The baker's daughter wordlessly slid a spoonful of salt across the table toward him. He used it to season his mutton. The fox, lounging by the fire, made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a laugh cut short by a premonition of doom. The northern ruins weren't far, as the crow flies, assuming the crow was suicidal. The path wound through the Weeping Woods, where the trees whispered secrets that drove men to dig their own graves just for some quiet. Beyond that lay the Valley of Echoes, where sounds had a habit of coming back, altered. And finally, the Singing Stones themselves. 3 monoliths that hummed at frequencies known to liquefy certain internal organs. Reginald set off at dawn, whistling. His first mistake was ignoring the birch tree at the wood's edge, its bark carved with the words "Put on your blindfold now" in letters deep enough to hold rainwater. His second was pausing to chuckle at the sign. The trees, who had seen this exact scenario play out 17 times that month, sighed in unison. By midday, Reginald had acquired 7 new imaginary friends, all of whom insisted he bury his boots for safekeeping. By dusk he'd begun sobbing at the beauty of a particularly inspiring patch of lichen. When he stumbled into the Valley of Echoes, his own voice came back to him as a chorus of dead relatives politely suggesting he turn around. Still he pressed on. The Singing Stones loomed ahead, their hum vibrating in his teeth. Local legend claimed they granted visions to those who touched them, which was true if one counted visions as the hallucinations preceding death by cranial explosion. Reginald, now missing one boot and wearing a wreath of poisonous ivy as a thinking cap, embraced the nearest monolith like a long-lost brother. The sound it made was less a song, and more the noise of 1,000 violins being fed through a meat grinder. Birds within a 3-mile radius fell dead from the sky. A nearby badger spontaneously composed its last will and testament. Reginald miraculously survived, though when he returned to the village he insisted his name was Moonlace the Enlightened and could only communicate in limericks about celery. The villagers, long accustomed to the peculiar side effects of unpreparedness, simply nodded and added blindfolds to the list of items sold at the general store. And the singing stones, their appetite temporarily sated, fell silent, waiting for the next fool to come along. Some lessons, after all, had to be learned the hard way. But then, that was why Black Hollow's graveyard had a separate wing for educational experiences. Chapter 10. The One Who Made Deals with Fairies. Black Hollow had 3 absolute rules when it came to the fair folk. Never thank them. Never dance with them. And above all, never, under any circumstances, make a bargain with them. The villagers knew this, the way they knew not to lick frozen iron or whisper their full names into wells. It was basic survival. Enter Eveline of the Silver Tongue. Eveline was a woman who could talk the feathers off a goose and convince it was better off naked. She'd bargained her way out of a goblin marriage contract, negotiated the return of a stolen child from a river hag using only puns, and once convinced a troll that yes, actually, Jit ye owed here bridge toll. She was, in short, exactly the sort of person who should have known better. The trouble began on a Thursday, already an unlucky day for dealings with the unseen. Eveline was mending a kettle in her cottage when the air turned suddenly crisp like the pause before a lightning strike. Then, with a smell of crushed mint and wet chalk, he appeared. The fairy lord stood no taller than her knee, but his presence filled the room like a held breath. His eyes were the blue of a gas flame, his hair the white of a fish's belly. He bowed, a motion like a scythe cutting wheat, and said, "I have come for the debt." Eveline blinked. "What debt?" "The one you're about to incur." She should have stopped there. She really should have. But Eveline had spent a lifetime winning verbal battles, and the idea that she might lose one was as foreign to her as silence. The terms seemed simple enough. The fairy would grant her the ability to understand any language, human, animal, or otherwise. In return, she owed him a story. Any story? Eveline asked, already composing a particularly dull tale about turnip farming in her head. Any story you know, the fairy agreed, smiling. She should have noticed his teeth were slightly too sharp. The magic took immediately. Eveline gasped as the world erupted into voices. The chittering of mice in the walls, the low grumble of her hearthstones complaining about the damp, even the faint, smug commentary of her own shadow. It was intoxicating. Then the fairy held out his hand. "My payment." Eveline opened her mouth to recite her turnip epic, and froze. Her tongue moved, but no sound came out. The fairy's smile widened. "You know many stories," he said gently, "but you never specified you'd be the one telling them." Understanding dawned too late. The magic wasn't stealing her voice, it was collecting. Every story she'd ever known, every tale she'd ever heard, was being pulled from her mind like thread from a spool. Her childhood lullabies, her grandmother's ghost stories, even the half-remembered gossip of long-dead neighbors. All of it flowed into the fairy's waiting grasp. When it was over, Eveline stood empty as a drum. The fairy, now glowing faintly with stolen narratives, patted her cheek. "A pleasure doing business." Back in the village, the baker's daughter was the first to notice something wrong. "Eveline?" she asked, as the woman stared blankly at the market stalls. "Did you hear about old Tomas's new pig?" Eveline turned her head. "Once," she said, her voice hollow as a rotted log, "there was a pig." She stopped blinking. The baker's daughter went pale. Oh, no. By sundown, the whole village knew. Eveline could still speak, but only in broken fragments, the shredded remains of stories not quite fully taken. The fairy, true to his word, had left her the bare bones of language, but none of the meat. The fox, curled by the inn's fire, watched as the villagers debated whether to seek vengeance. "Don't bother," it yawned. "He'll be back in a century or two. They always come back when the stories run dry." And high in their hollow hills, the fair folk laughed, because the cruelest part of the bargain was this: Eveline could still hear stories. She just couldn't keep them. So she wandered Black Hollow, a living parchment scrap, collecting tales she'd forget by morning, while the fairy lord grew fat on feasts of narrative, each one seasoned with her despair. Some debts, after all, were never meant to be repaid. But then, that was why the wise left milk and lies at their doorsteps, and never ever answered when the knocking came in threes. Chapter 11. The Unlucky Servant. In the grand tapestry of fate, some threads existed solely to be snipped. Black Hollow understood this better than most. For every heroic prince who slew the dragon, there were a dozen stable boys who had mysteriously tripped onto spears to establish the dragon's menace. For every clever peasant girl who outwitted the witch, there were 3 unnamed sisters who had previously disappeared into the oven to prove the witch's cruelty. Enta Marnie the Expendable. Marnie was the kitchen maid at Black Hollow's only tavern, a position that placed her squarely in the category of background decoration with a pulse. She scrubbed pots, she carried ale, she occasionally coughed meaningfully when protagonists needed a hint about poisoned wine. She was, in short, exactly the sort of person who tended to vanish right before the third act. The tavern's latest guest was a man who called himself Aldrich the Cunning, a title that should have been a warning, as anyone who needed to announce their own cleverness rarely was. He arrived cloaked in shadows that seemed to cling to him like hungry cats, his eyes darting about the room as if memorizing exits. Marnie, being professionally invisible, noticed 3 things. First, Aldrich's boots were caked with cemetery dirt. Second, the pouch at his belt occasionally wriggled like a bag of live eels. Third, and most damning, he'd asked specifically for Itai the back table near the kitchen, prime positioning for a dramatic murder. She brought his stew anyway. Aldrich grabbed her wrist as she set down the bowl. "You seem observant." Marnie had been called many things: mousy, forgettable, once even that thing that lives in the pantry, but never observant. It was almost flattering. "I need a message delivered," he whispered. "To the old oak at midnight. No one can know." Marnie hesitated. In stories, this was the moment where wise servants feigned deafness or developed sudden religious obligations. But Aldrich pressed a coin into her palm, an actual silver piece, not the usual copper and excuses, and added, "There will be more if you're discreet." She should have refused. She would have refused, if she hadn't been saving up for a new pair of shoes, the current ones being more whole than leather. Midnight found her at the oak, the note clutched in her damp hand. The tree's hollow mouth exhaled damp, fungal breath as she reached inside to leave the message. Something grabbed her. Not Aldrich. Not even human. The thing that slithered from the hollow wore Aldrich's face like a poorly fitted mask, its true form all grasping tendrils and teeth like broken glass. "Ah," it crooned, "the messenger." Marnie had just enough time to realize 2 terrible truths. First, the note wasn't a message, it was a binding sigil, and her delivery had completed the circle. Second, Aldrich hadn't been running gay something. He'd been running gay toward his next victim. Then the screaming started. Back at the tavern, Aldrich toasted his empty ale to the night. "To disposable characters," he murmured. The wriggling pouch at his belt fell still, its contents finally sated. The next morning, the villagers found Marnie's shoes at the base of the oak, neatly placed, as if she'd simply stepped out of them. The baker's daughter, who had once survived being the expendable friend by the simple expedient of yawning a very large knife, crossed herself. Old Thomas sighed. Should have paid her more. Aldrich left town at dawn, his cloak heavier with whatever he'd traded Marnie's life for. No one followed. No one swore vengeance. That wasn't how these stories worked. And in the shadows, the fox licked its paws clean and waited for the next unlucky soul to stumble into a role they wouldn't survive. Some parts, after all, were only ever meant to be played once. But then, that was why smart servants always demanded payment up front, and never ever read the notes they carried. Chapter 12. The Curious Meddler. Black Hollow had a long tradition of sealed things that were meant to stay that way. The well with the iron padlock, the attic room with the painted-over door, the little ebony box that had been passed down through the Claiborne family, with a strict instruction to never, under any circumstances, shake it to see what was inside. These were not suggestions. They were the distilled wisdom of generations who had learned the hard way that curiosity didn't just kill the cat. It often took out several bystanders in the process. Enter Livia, the inevitable. Livia was the sort of person who couldn't walk past a "Do not touch" sign without developing a physical compulsion to do exactly that. As a child, she had pried open a witch's spell book to see if the letters wriggled. They did, and one of them bit her. As a teenager, she had untied a knotted rope hanging from the old gallows, just to see what would happen. What happened was 3 months of bad luck and a very persistent ghost who kept asking for help, finding its missing teeth. Now, as an adult with neither the wisdom nor the survival instincts to stop herself, she stood in the Claiborne attic, staring at the little ebony box. It was smaller than she expected, the size of a jewelry case, but heavier. The wood was unnaturally smooth, as if it had been sanded by something with very fine claws. The clasp had no keyhole, but when she ran her finger along the seam, she could have sworn she felt something inside shift in response. Finn Claiborne, who had been sent to supervise, a task roughly equivalent to asking a mayfly to guard a pond, yawned from his perch on a stack of moldy ledgers. "You're not supposed to touch that." Livia didn't look up. "Why not?" "Granddad said it's bad." "Did he say why?" Finn scratched his head. "I think the last person who opened it turned inside out. Or maybe it was their shadow that got stuck in there. Honestly, I wasn't really listening." Livia weighed the box in her hands. It was warm. "What if I just open it a little?" The box, sensing her intention, clicked open on its own. For a single blissful second, there was silence. Then the screaming started. Not from the box. From the outsiding. Livia dropped the box just as the first shriek ripped through the village. A sound like metal being bent the wrong way. The attic window showed a scene of chaos. Villagers bolting doors, livestock stampeding, the sky twisting into colors that didn't have names. From the box, a thin black smoke curled out, forming shapes that might have been fingers if fingers were made of liquid hunger. Finn, who had once survived drinking an entire bottle of probably potion by the simple expedient of Gigi being too stubborn to die, grabbed Livia's arm. "We should go." "What is that?" Livia whispered. "Dunno, but I think it's late for dinner." The smoke solidified into something with too many joints, and a smile like a split seam. Turned its head toward Livia, with the slow, deliberate motion of a predator who knew it had all the time in the world. She did the only sensible thing. She screamed and threw the box out the window. The creature followed, but not before pausing to pat Finn on the head like an old friend. Then it was gone, flowing into the streets, where the sound of splintering wood and abruptly cut-off shouts suggested it was making up for lost time. Downstairs, the baker's daughter was already barricading the door. "What did you do?" Livia, still shaking, held up the now empty box. "I just wanted to see what was inside." Old Thomas, who had been through this exact scenario 3 times before, sighed and reached for the ledger where they kept track of village disasters. "Add it to the list," he muttered. "Noon Tuesday." Livia unleashed the howling whatever. Again. By sundown, the creature had eaten 7 chickens, 2 outhouses, and the moral high ground. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it dissipated, leaving behind only a faint smell of burnt sugar and a single shriveled shadow clinging to the church steeple. The box, when they found it, was closed again. The clasp had reset. Finn picked it up and handed it back to Livia with a grin. "Wanna try for round two?" Some curses, after all, were patient. But then, that was why wise people left well enough alone, and why Black Hollow kept a special set of shackles just for Livia. Chapter 13. The Unlucky Commoner. Some people were born to be heroes. Others were born to be the nameless villagers who got eaten in the first 5 minutes to establish the threat level. Black Hollow had always excelled at producing the latter. Tobias the Unremarkable had lived his entire life in the shadow of the Bleakwood, not by choice, but because real estate near cursed forests came cheap. His cottage stood exactly halfway between the safely distant and actively haunted zones, a no-man's land where the thatch occasionally screamed at passers-by, and the garden grew vegetables that blinked. On the morning the curse manifested, Tobias was engaged in his usual routine of milking his goat, which had 3 eyes and a tendency to recite prophecies when stressed, when the ground began to shake. Not the dramatic world-ending sort of tremor, but the kind that suggested something large and unpleasant had just rolled over in its sleep. "Ah," said the goat, chewing thoughtfully on Tobias' sleeve. "The blood moon rises." Tobias sighed. "It's midday." "The metaphorical blood moon," the goat clarified, just as the first wave of black fog rolled down from the Bleakwood. The fog moved with purpose, tendrils snaking around tree trunks and through fence posts like a hunter tracking prey. By the time it reached Tobias' front gate, it had solidified into the shape of 100 grasping hands, all reaching for his chicken coop. Now, a wiser man might have taken this as his cue to leave. But Tobias had spent 37 years surviving on bad luck and stubbornness. He grabbed his pitchfork, the one with "Beware" the teeth carved into the handle by some previous, presumably deceased owner, and marched toward the fog. "Those are my chickens," he announced to the emptiness. The fog paused. Then it laughed, a sound like icicles breaking in a hollow log. From the trees emerged the source of the disturbance, the wailing night, a spectral figure whose armor was made of frozen tears, and whose sword sang with the voices of everyone who'd ever died inconveniently to further a hero's journey. "Flee, mortal," the night intoned, raising its weeping blade. "This land is forfeit to the Dark Lord's will." Tobias squinted. Which Dark Lord? The one with the mole, or the one who keeps forgetting people's names? The night hesitated. Its script clearly hadn't accounted for follow-up questions. Behind Tobias, the goat cleared its throat. "The third one, tall fellow. Bad breath." "Oh, he may." Tobias spat to the side. "He still owes me for 3 hens last summer." The wailing night, unaccustomed to being treated like a particularly irritating tax collector, swung its sword in a dramatic arc. The blade passed through Tobias' body and out the other side, leaving him completely unharmed. They all stared at each other. The goat broke the silence. "Told you that salt bath would pay off." It turned out that 37 years of living in a cursed buffer zone had given Tobias a sort of supernatural immunity, the narrative equivalent of leftover takeout, that even the Dark Lords couldn't stomach. The wailing night tried every trick in its arsenal. Ominous pronouncements, reality-warping screams, even the classic "your soul is forfeit" speech. Tobias yawned through all of it. By sundown, the night gave up and left, its dramatic exit somewhat ruined by having to squeeze past Tobias' washing line. The fog dissipated. The chickens clucked indignantly about the disruption to their schedule. Back in the village, the baker's daughter listened to Tobias' account while kneading dough. "So you're telling me you bored a ghost into surrender?" Tobias shrugged. "Just pointed out his armor was rusting. Then we talked about turnip prices." Old Tomas chuckled into his ale. "Should have known. Nothing kills drama faster than an accountant's eye for detail." And high in his tower, the latest Dark Lord crossed Black Hollow off his list of conquests with a note that simply read, "Not worth the paperwork. Guys, no day. Some people, it seemed, were simply too ordinary to die properly. But then, that was why sensible villains always skipped the middle-of-nowhere villages where the peasants asked too many questions about their evil monologues. Chapter 14. The one who didn't learn from others' mistakes. Black Hollow's tavern had a wall dedicated to cautionary tales. Not paintings or plaques. Actual artifacts nailed to the beams as reminders. The shattered remains of a lucky witch's mirror. The petrified hand of a man who'd tried to cheat death at cards. A preserved tongue from the last person who'd insulted the forest's spirits. The collection grew yearly, yet somehow, people kept adding to it. Enter Florian, the oblivious. Florian blew into town on a wind that smelled suspiciously of bad decisions, his cloak sewn with protective runes that had clearly been copied by someone who'd never actually seen a rune before. He took one look at the tavern's warning wall and laughed loud enough to disturb the hanging skull of the previous laugher. Superstitious nonsense, he declared, slapping the counter. I'll wager half these fools just tripped and blamed magic. Old Thomas slid an ale toward him slowly, the way one might offer a lit torch to a sleepwalker. That tongue belonged to Jareth the Loud, called the Dryads overgrown shrubs. Last words he ever spoke. Florian snorted, probably choked on his own stupidity. He grabbed the tongue and, before anyone could stop him, popped it in his mouth like a piece of jerky. The tavern fell silent. Even the fire stopped crackling out of sheer second-hand horror. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then Florian's eyes widened. His hands flew to his throat as the tongue squirmed to life, growing roots that plunged down his windpipe. He collapsed, thrashing, as the thing grafted itself permanently where his own tongue had been. When the fit passed, Florian sat up, pale, shaking, and when he opened his mouth, it was Jareth's voice that emerged. Told you so, idiot. The villagers nodded solemnly. The skull on the wall seemed to grin wider. Undeterred, or perhaps now biologically incapable of learning, Florian set his sights on the Bleakwood's most infamous landmark. The Bridge of Whispers. 7 stones wide, moss-choked, and flanked by statues that wept black tears when the moon was full. The rules were simple. Cross quickly, don't answer the voices, and whatever you do, don't look down at your reflection in the water below. 19 memorial cairns lined the approach. Florian counted them aloud, in Jareth's voice, which made it doubly unnerving, as he strolled toward the bridge at midday. 18 people couldn't follow basic instructions. Watch me make it 20. The bridge welcomed him with a chorus of whispers in long-dead languages. Florian waved them away like gnats. The water below showed his reflection grinning back, except its teeth were sharper, its eyes voids. He flipped it off. Midway across, the first stone gave way. Then the second. Florian barely noticed until the 5th stone crumbled underfoot, sending him tumbling toward the rapids below. What happened next was a matter of perspective. The villagers swore they saw the river itself reach up in liquid hands to drag him under. Florian's own reflection claimed, via interpretive dance performed in the moonlight, that he'd simply tripped. Either way, the result was the same. A 20th cairn joined the collection by sundown. Back at the tavern, the baker's daughter poured ale for Florian's reflection, which had taken up residence in her mixing bowl. Any last wisdom? The reflection swirled its ale thoughtfully. Nah, let the next idiot figure it out. Old Thomas sighed and reached for the hammer. There was always room for one more warning on the wall. Some lessons, after all, had to be taught in cycles. But then, that was why Black Hollow's graveyard had a revolving door, and why the tavern's warning collection would never be complete. Chapter 15. The Overly Honest Peasant. Truth was a luxury peasants could rarely afford, especially when speaking to those who held power over life and death. Black Hollow knew this better than most. The village had an entire graveyard section marked "Dex Should Have Lied," filled with those who had answered royal questions a bit too accurately. Enter Bertram the Blunt. Bertram was a man who couldn't tell a polite lie if his life depended on it, which, on this particular morning, it very much did. King Baldric the Temperamental had come to Black Hollow on one of his infamous progress visits, which meant his treasury was empty and he was looking for excuses to find someone. The villagers had hidden their best livestock and their least offensive children, leaving Bertram, who had been busy fixing his roof and missed the warning bells, as the unlucky soul standing in the town square when the royal procession arrived. The king, resplendent in ermine-trimmed robes that did nothing to hide his gut, looked down from his horse. "You there, peasant? Does this village prosper under my just rule?" Bertram wiped his hands on his tunic and considered the question. His cottage leaked when it rained. His last harvest had been half devoured by enchanted locusts. The king's tax collectors had taken his best chicken just the week before, leaving him with only the one that laid bloody eggs. "Well?" the king prompted, his smile already tightening at the edges. Bertram opened his mouth. A smart man would have said, "Oh yes, your majesty, we all sleep on piles of gold, thanks to your wisdom." Moderately intelligent man might have offered 8 times a heart, "But we're sure you'll fix everything." Annie Bertram, who had the self-preservation instincts of a carrot, said not really, "No be." "No." The royal entourage gasped as one. The king's face turned an interesting shade of purple. "Explain," he commanded, in a tone that suggested explanations would only determine how creative the execution would be. Bertram, blissfully unaware of the danger, ticked points off on his fingers. "Well, the bridge collapsed after you took the repair taxes. The miller's daughter got drafted into your royal coven and came back able to turn people into frogs. And just last week your tax collectors took my only good chicken." He paused. "She was a good layer." The king stroked his beard. "I see. And tell me, peasant, what do you think of my new royal robes?" They were hideous. The ermine trim was molting, the purple dye had run in the rain, and the whole ensemble made the king look like a drunken eggplant. Bertram opened his mouth. The baker's daughter, who had crept close enough to kick Bertram in the ankle, interrupted with a curtsy. "Magnificent, your grace, a vision of royal splendor." Bertram rubbed his ankle. "They look like a wine stain with delusions of grandeur." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold to libraries. King Baldric's smile showed every one of his crooked teeth. "Guards, prepare the truth-teller's punishment." The villagers collectively winced. The truth-teller's punishment changed weekly, depending on the king's mood and how much he'd had to drink. Last month it had involved honey, fire ants, and a very confused bear. Today's punishment was peculiarly poetic. The royal wizard, a nervous man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, conjured a glowing orb that pulsed with soft light. "This," the king announced, "will force you to speak only truth for the rest of your days." He leaned forward. "Let's see how you like living without tea." The orb flew at Bertram's face and vanished into his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, "That wizard's robe is on backwards," Bertram observed. The wizard looked down in alarm. "And you've got something green in your beard, your majesty." The king's hand flew to his face. "That horse is about to—" The royal steed chose that moment to relieve itself spectacularly on the king's boots. Chaos erupted. By the time the king's guards had restored order, Bertram had managed to point out 7 hidden stains, 3 secret affairs, and the fact that the enchanted royal scepter was actually just painted wood. King Baldric, now trembling with rage, drew his sword. "I should have you executed?" Bertram nodded. "You probably should. But then who'd tell you your breath smells like a goblin's armpit?" The sword wavered. The guards hesitated. The villagers held their collective breath. Then, inexplicably, the king began to laugh. It started as a wheeze, built to a guffaw, and ended with him clutching his sides in tears. "Guards," he gasped, "let him go. Anyone this honest is clearly too stupid to conspire against me." Bertram blinked. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. The king wiped his eyes. You're coming to court. I need someone to tell me when my advisors are lying. He pointed a jeweled finger. But if you ever mention my breath again, I'll have your tongue turned into a belt. As the royal procession departed with considerably less dignity than it had arrived, the baker's daughter stared at Bertram. How are you still alive? Bertram shrugged. Turns out kings hear lies so often. The truth sounds refreshing. Old Thomas, watching from the tavern door, shook his head and moved the "Ich should have lied" sign a few graves over. Some truths, it seemed, were too absurd to kill over. But then, that was why Black Hollow kept its best lies polished and ready, just in case the next royal visitor had less of a sense of humor. Chapter 16. The Unlucky Guest. Black Hollow had an unspoken rule about unexpected invitations. If the host was richer than you, better dressed than you, and smiling just a little too wide, you were probably the main course. The village had lost 3 tailors, a candlemaker, and 1 very optimistic minstrel to dinners that started with wine and ended with screaming. Enter Edwin, the oblivious. Edwin was a traveling scribe with terrible eyesight and the situational awareness of a concussed pigeon. When the silver-edged invitation fluttered down from a passing raven and landed in his porridge, he took it as divine providence rather than what it was, a predator testing the water. Lord Blackthorn requests the pleasure of your company for dinner, he read aloud, squinting at the elegant script. Below, in much smaller letters that Edwin cheerfully ignored, it added, "Rye, bring your own salt. None, but one big lay. You see she." The baker's daughter peered over his shoulder. "Blackthorn's the one with the castle that moves when you're not looking, right?" Old Thomas nodded. "Last month it was in the valley. Yesterday it was on the cliff. Tonight it'll probably be inside someone's nightmares." Edwin, busy polishing his one good quill, didn't seem concerned. "A noble patron. This could be my big break." The fox, lounging by the fire, made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a sigh. At dusk, Edwin set off toward the coordinates on the invitation, a patch of forest that definitely hadn't contained a castle that morning. Now, however, Blackthorn Keep loomed over the treetops, its spires twisting like frozen smoke, its gates carved with faces that tracked Edwin's approach. The doors swung open before he could knock. Inside, the air smelled of roasting meat and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with portraits where the subject's eyes followed visitors and occasionally winked. At the head of a table long enough to see 20, but set for 2, sat Lord Blackthorn. Blackthorn was everything a noble shouldn't be. Too handsome, too pale, and with teeth just a shade too sharp when he smiled. "Ah, our honored guest," he purred, gesturing to the lone chair opposite him. "I do so love entertaining scholars comme." Edwin, oblivious to the way the word scholars dripped like sauce from a rib, took his seat. "Your castle is magnificent, my lord. However do you keep the stonework so fluid?" Blackthorn's smile widened. "Trade secrets." He snapped his fingers, and the first course appeared, a soup that swirled on its own, forming shapes that almost looked like screaming faces before dissolving. Over dinner, 7 courses, each more suspicious than the last, Blackthorn asked increasingly personal questions about Edwin's family, his travels, whether he'd ever been cursed before. Edwin answered everything with cheerful honesty, complimenting the remarkably human-tasting venison and admiring the chandelier made of what appeared to be frozen tears. It wasn't until dessert arrived, a trembling blancmange that whimpered when cut, that Edwin finally hesitated. "That's not normal, is it?" Blackthorn leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like a cat's. "Tell me, scribe, have you ever wondered why I invited you?" Edwin considered this. "My sparkling wit, my extensive knowledge of royal genealogies? Because Blackthorn said, producing a contract from thin air. I require a new, let's call it AG Chronicle, for my library. He tapped the parchment, where the ink slithered into new shapes. Your life story, in your own hand. Every memory, every secret, every regret. Edwin blinked at the quill that had appeared in his hand. It was warm. And if I refuse? The shadows deepened. The portraits leaned closer. Blackthorn's smile never wavered. Then you'll be the 8th course. Back in the village, the baker's daughter startled awake as something heavy hit her windowsill. Outside, Edwin lay sprawled in the herb garden, covered in what smelled like rancid cream and still clutching a quill made of bone. Didn't sign? He mumbled. Told him I only do illuminated manuscripts. The next morning, Blackthorn Keep was gone from the cliff, but the villagers found a new portrait in the tavern. It showed a very frustrated-looking nobleman chewing what appeared to be a quill. Old Thomas raised a toast. To bad penmanship saving lives. And the fox, watching from the rafters, made a mental note to steal Edwin's spectacles before he got himself into worse trouble. Some invitations, after all, were better left unanswered, but then that was why Black Hollow kept a stack of pre-written refusal letters by the door. Chapter 17. The one who underestimated talking animals. Black Hollow had a strict hierarchy when it came to wisdom. Cats at the top, followed by ravens and foxes, then the occasional prophetic toad, and at the very bottom, somewhere below the sentient mold growing behind the tavern, came human intuition. The villagers knew this. They had learned through generations of unfortunate incidents that when a bird tells you not to go into the woods, you listen. And when a cat gives you side-eye, you apologize immediately for whatever you'd done wrong. Enter Captain Florian of the Royal Guard. Florian was a man who measured intelligence in sword lengths and common sense in armor thickness. Sent by the king to investigate the nonsense rumors of Black Hollow's enchanted wildlife, he arrived in the village with a company of soldiers and the unshakable belief that animals should be seen, not heard. His first mistake was kicking the inn's cat off his chair. The cat? A grizzled tabby named Malkin, who had once outwitted a demon in a riddle contest, landed gracefully and fixed Florian with a look that promised retribution in small, inconvenient ways. You'll want to sleep with your boots on tonight, Malkin remarked, licking a paw. Florian snorted. I don't take orders from overgrown mousetraps. The villagers collectively winced. Old Thomas made the sign of the warding horn behind his back. The next morning, Florian's boots were gone. Not stolen, but hewn medi, the leather unraveled stitch by stitch into a pile of confused-looking threads. His armor had been polished to a mirror sheen. On the inside. Trickery! Florian bellowed, stomping barefoot to the stables, which immediately developed a sudden leak directly over his head. When I find whatever prankster. A raven perched on the stable roof cleared its throat. The west bridge is out. Florian glared. And I should trust the word of a glorified crow. The raven ruffled its feathers. Suit yourself. Enjoy the swamp. 2 hours later, Florian and his men stood hip-deep in what the locals called quicksand for idiots, their horses eyeing them with the resigned disappointment of creatures who'd tried to warn them. Told you, said the raven, circling overhead. Florian, now missing one boot to the mud's digestive tendencies, snarled. Next animal that talks gets made into a hat. This, as the baker's daughter would later remark, was his second mistake. That evening, as Florian's men struggled to start a fire, their kindling kept scuttling away, a fox sauntered into camp. Not Guy Fawkes, though that one was watching from a safe distance, but one of its many cousins, this one with a knowing grin and a fondness for dramatic irony. You lot should leave, it said, scratching behind one ear. The woods get hungry at night. Florian drew his sword. I'll show you hungry. The fox sighed. Never mind. You're right where you need to be." Then it vanished into the undergrowth. Midnight found the camp in chaos. The soldiers' tents had developed teeth and bitten several fingers. Their rations had grown legs and scampered off. Their horses, after a brief conference with a passing owl, had unanimously decided to unionize and deserted. And Florian? Florian was currently being held aloft by what appeared to be an irate shrub. "You were warned," said the cat, the raven, and the fox in unison from the safety of a nearby rock. The shrub shook Florian like a disobedient puppy. "No," it rumbled in a voice like creaking roots. He was warned multiple times. Braggart. Dawn found Florian dangling from the town well by his underwear, his pride thoroughly shattered, his men scattered to the four winds, and a single word carved into his breastplate by what looked like very precise claws. "Listen." The villagers, used to this sort of thing, went about their morning routines. The baker's daughter tossed Florian a towel. The cat reclaimed its chair. And old Thomas, after a thoughtful pause, added a new item to the tavern's menu. Roasted humility, served cold. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. But then, that was why Black Hollow's animals held all the best gossip, and why sensible travelers always carried spare boots. Chapter 18. The Unfortunate Witness. Black Hollow had an old saying, "See nothing, hear nothing, live longer." It was carved into the well cover, scratched onto the tavern's back door, and tattooed, against their will, on at least 3 overly curious travelers. The village understood that some things existed in the periphery of vision, shapes that moved when you turned your head, rituals performed in moonlit clearings, mayors who definitely didn't have that many teeth last Tuesday, and the wise pretended not to notice. Enter Tom the Nosy. Tom was a tinker by trade and a busybody by nature, the sort of man who couldn't walk past a closed door without wondering what scandal lay behind it. He arrived in Black Hollow during the Festival of Veils, when sensible folk stayed indoors and the things that weren't quite folk walked the streets wearing human skins like ill-fitting coats. "Odd time to visit," old Thomas remarked as Tom set up his cart near the square. Tom winked. "Best time for business, if you ask me. People always need trinkets when they're celebrating." He held up a hand mirror that reflected slightly too many eyes. "Got just the thing for a festival." The baker's daughter, who recognized cursed objects the way others recognized bad cheese, backed away slowly. "That mirror's looking at me." Tom laughed. "Nonsense. Just fine Venetian craftsmanship." As dusk fell, the real festivities began. Figures draped in gray silk moved through the streets, their faces hidden behind masks that seemed to melt and reform with each step. The air smelled of burnt honey and wet stone. Tom, convinced this was some quaint local custom, set up his wares with extra enthusiasm. It wasn't until midnight, when he ducked into an alley to relieve himself, that he saw it. Behind the butcher's shop, 3 of the veiled figures stood in a triangle, their masks now hanging limp from their hands. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were voids of swirling shadow, punctuated by distant pinpricks of light like far-off stars. One reached into its own chest and withdrew a pulsing orb that throbbed in time with Tom's suddenly racing heartbeat. He should have run. He should have gone. Instead, Tom the Nosy did what he did best. He leaned closer. The orb flared. The figures turned as one. The last thing Tom saw was his own reflection in their star-filled gazes, and the terrible understanding that some sights unravel the viewer as surely as a dropped stitch unravels a sweater. Back in the square, the festival continued uninterrupted. The baker's daughter found Tom's cart abandoned, the hand mirror now reflecting only a swirling darkness. She smashed it under her boot without hesitation. Old Thomas surveyed the empty street and sighed. Should have charged him for the tattoo. At dawn, the villagers found Tom's hat floating in the duck pond, perfectly dry. Inside were 7 copper coins and a note that read, EAA4, the trouble in handwriting. That definitely wasn't human. The fox, licking its paws on the church steps, watched as they debated what to do with the money. New well rope, it suggested. The old one's about to snap. And high above, the stars twinkled with suspicious amusement, as they always did when mortals learned the hard way that curiosity didn't just kill the cat. Sometimes it unmade the witness entirely. But then that was why Black Hollow's children were taught to sleep with their eyes shut tight on festival nights, and why the village budget always included a line item for unexpected memorial expenses. Chapter 19. The One Who Trusted the Mirror. There were 3 rules about enchanted mirrors in Black Hollow. Never ask one about the future, never believe it when it flattered you, and never, under any circumstances, ask it what it really thought of you. The village's graveyard had an entire section dedicated to those who had ignored these rules, their headstones carved with helpful reminders like, A, ye should use a normal mirror, and then J, told you so. Enter Lady Seraphina of the Golden Vanity. Seraphina had arrived in Black Hollow by accident. Her carriage had taken a wrong turn while fleeing an ill-advised engagement to a minor demon, and she found the village quaint if somewhat morbid. What captured her attention, however, was the looking-glass hanging in the inn's common room. It was old, its silvering slightly tarnished, and its frame carved with warnings in a language no one could quite remember. "Don't touch that," the baker's daughter said as Seraphina reached for it. Seraphina arched a perfect eyebrow. "Why? Does it bite?" "Worse," old Thomas grunted from his usual seat by the fire. "Eddie answers." This, of course, made it irresistible. Seraphina stood before the mirror, admiring her own reflection. The cascade of golden hair, the porcelain complexion, the eyes like chips of glacial ice. "Mirror, mirror," she mused, "who is the fairest in the land?" The glass rippled like disturbed water. Her reflection smiled back at her, but it was wrong. The teeth too sharp, the gaze too knowing. "This precise moment," the mirror replied, its voice like the echo of a whisper in an empty hall. "You are, of course, but ask again tomorrow." Seraphina should have stopped there. But vanity, like bad decisions, thrived on encouragement. She returned every morning without fail, basking in the mirror's praise, ignoring the way her reflection sometimes lingered a second too long when she turned away. Then came the day the mirror said, "Whither is a woman in the next town fairer than you?" Seraphina's smile froze. "Who? Wouldn't you like to know?" The mirror purred. Thus began the descent. The mirror's advice grew increasingly erratic. "Wash your face in morning dew from the graveyard." Her skin broke out in weeping sores. "Pluck a hair from a living raven." The bird plucked back, taking a lock of her golden mane with it. "Only the heart of your rival can restore your beauty." The rival in question turned out to be a dairy farmer's wife with no idea who Seraphina even was. Still, she trusted the mirror, even when her reflection began moving on its own, even when it started offering advice unprompted, even when it whispered, "You could join me in here, you know. It's lovely." The breaking point came when the baker's daughter caught Seraphina attempting to climb into the mirror, her arms already submerged to the elbows in the glass like quicksand. "Told you," the baker's daughter sighed, grabbing Seraphina's ankle before the mirror could claim the rest of her. With a sound like shattering ice, the mirror released its hold, leaving Seraphina sprawled on the floor, her arms slick with something that wasn't quite liquid. The glass had gone dark, her reflection nowhere to be seen. Then slowly, a new figure appeared in the mirror. A woman with golden hair and a smile like a knife. "Oh, well," said Seraphina's own voice from inside the glass. "Good tears always next time." Old Thomas nailed a tapestry over the mirror the next morning. The baker's daughter took Seraphina to the river to wash the remaining tarnish from her arms. "Why'd you keep listening to it?" Seraphina, now considerably humbled, stared at her wavering reflection in the water. "It told me what I wanted to hear." The fox, watching from the reeds, flicked its tail. That's how they get you. And somewhere in the dark behind the tapestry, the mirror waited, patient as always, for the next vain soul to ask the wrong question. Some reflections, after all, were better left undisturbed. But then, that was why Black Hollow's wise women used polished obsidian instead of glass, and why the villagers knew better than to trust anything that smiled back. Chapter 20. The Forgotten Sacrifice. Black Hollow's stories always had heroes, brave souls who faced witches, outwitted curses, and returned home victorious. But for every hero who strode into legend, there were a dozen others who made their victory possible, and were never mentioned again. The village's oldest graves had no names, only descriptions. Why, the man who held the dory, the girl who distracted the dragoning, the merchant who gave the right directions at the right timing. These were the forgotten sacrifices, the ones who died in the margins so the story could go on. No one remembered the miller's apprentice who stayed behind to slow the advancing goblin horde just long enough for the village to bar its gates. His name had faded from memory, but the mill still creaked with the echo of his last stand on its steps. No one recalled the old herbalist who brewed the poison that felled the Wolf King, drinking it herself to ensure the dose was fatal before his teeth could find the hero's throat. The meadow where her cottage once stood bloomed with crimson flowers no one dared pick. No one spoke of the 6 volunteers who tested the enchanted bridge first, stepping onto its cursed planks one by one until they learned a safe path across. Their bodies were never recovered, but travelers could sometimes hear whispers in the mist below, still counting steps. The baker's daughter knew. She had grown up hearing the stories, the Geolan stories, from old Thomas, who made sure the dead got their due even if the living had moved on. They say Finn Claiborne outrun the Shadow Hound, the villagers would boast. Old Thomas would grunt into his ale. Aye, because Jason the Tanner threw himself in its path first. That hound didn't stop for 3 days after. The fox knew too. It had watched generations of villagers play their parts, seen the way history folded itself around the convenient deaths, smoothing them into footnotes. And then there was the Well of Echoes. It stood at the edge of the village, its waters black as ink and twice as bitter. Drop a coin in, and it would tell you a truth, not the polished kind fit for ballads, but the ugly, necessary ones. The baker's daughter stood before it now, holding a single copper piece. For the forgotten, she murmured, and let it fall. The water shivered. Then one by one voices rose from the depths, not screaming, not lamenting, simply speaking. The miller's apprentice, laughing as he sharpened his knife before the end. The herbalist humming her last lullaby. The bridge-walkers still counting. The well didn't promise remembrance. It didn't offer justice. It simply let them speak, for the length of a coin's ripple, before sinking back into silence. That evening, the baker's daughter added a new loaf to the tavern's offerings, black bread studded with raisins like old coins. For the ones who didn't make it, was all she said. The villagers ate, in quiet understanding. The fox took its share to the oldest graves, and the wind carried the crumbs away, scattering them like unspoken names across the fields. Stories needed heroes, but they ran on sacrifices. And in Black Hollow, at least, those sacrifices were never entirely forgotten, just waiting their turn to be heard.